Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Live Free, Ride Free. I'm your host, Rupert Isaacson, New York Times bestselling author of The Horse Boy and The Long Ride Home. Before I jump in with today's guest, I want to say a huge thank you to you, our audience, for helping to make this happen. I have a request. If you like what we do here, please give it a thumbs up, like, subscribe, tell a friend. It really, really helps us to make the progress. To find out about our certification courses, online video libraries, books, and other courses, please go to rupertisaacson.com. So now let's jump in. Welcome back to Live Free, Ride Free. Today I've got Jeff Tomhave. He's a lawyer, he's Native American, he has a unique perspective, not just on the American experience and, the world experience of America, but also on the America within America. And many of us who are not American, or at least not born there, have a perception of the USA, usually based around what we see coming through the media of one kind or another. But the truth is that there are many Americas, and that the Native American experience is something that I think is probably unfamiliar, hidden from most outsiders, because it's just not what is presented front and center in the media experience to the outside world, except in certain enclaves of Hollywood, or a film dealing with the American West or something like that. But even then, it would be usually through the perspective of, a non-native film director or so. So it's great to be able to have you on, Jeff, because you have spent your life as a lawyer for tribal advocacy, which I suspect probably has not made you a multimillionaire, although I do hope it does one day. And you are, if I have it right, Hadapsa Nation, same geographic area, you informed me, as the Mandan and Arikiri, which for
Correct.
those listening from outside the USA or outside that area would be like the upper Missouri Basin sort of plains of the Dakotas. Would I be right
Yes.
in thinking that? And so that is an America within America. How does one live one's life as a tribal advocate? And maybe before we get into this, your name, Tomhave.
Okay. Yes.
Talk to us about the origin of that name, because I suspect that in the origin of names, we can learn a lot, and then we can go from there.
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because most people assume that Tomhave is some kind of indigenous name. It's actually German, 1/4 German, and the German ancestors. I'm sure you know this, Rupert. A lot of German immigrants moved to the Great Lakes area and the Upper Plains. So Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota is filled with Germans and
Germans and
German immigrants.
Scandinavians. Yeah.
Yes, and I've been told it's because that part of the United States looks like where they came from. So in doing my own genealogy research, I found that Tomhave is actually the shortened version. It was really Tom Haven, and
That would make
from
sense.
like I don't know, like the 1300s, it was Zoomhaven at one time. But
Okay.
anyway, that's where that name comes from. And throughout my life, teachers and other people have always assumed that it's some kind of indigenous name, and well, I just let them think that.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, I think one could be forgiven for thinking that, because it's not an obvious. If it was Tom Haven, one would automatically think Germanic. Yes, it's true. Tom Have, one does not. And I was actually busy Googling it as you were talking there. And it also seems to possibly have a Belgian, but it would be the Flemish, Dutch, what's the area? Friesland area name. And then it actually does make sense to me. And yeah, as you say, that's, rather like me, I'm a product of the colonial experience. My surname Isaacson was Lithuanian Jews who wanted to sound less Jewish and less Slavic in German Southwest Africa, so they misguidedly changed their name from Schmierkowitz to Isaacson, thinking this would make them more accepted. I don't know why they didn't go for like von Isaac or something like that, but nope, they went with Isaacson, which of course didn't work. The other side were all, Dutch and English and Scottish, and yeah, here I am, the mishmash. So, but you, despite the fact that the name is Germanic,
It's
um, are Native Americans. So, and why did you decide to get involved in tribal advocacy? Why not just go and live your life? And also, if you're going to become a lawyer, why not just go off and become the kind of lawyer that gets rich? Why not just, look after nice oil contracts in North Dakota or something like that, and then, retire to Palm Springs and play golf? Like, why did you choose the path you chose?
These are all good questions. I'm going
Probably
to
ask yourself that every day.
First, I want to swing back to my own heritage. So my father was, he was half. So he grew up on his reservation, the Fort Berthold Reservation in North Dakota, as a half breed. And so he wasn't Indian enough for the Indian kids, and he was not white enough for the white kids, and all of that. But on my mother's side, my mother's maiden name is Kitchkummy, and that is an indigenous name, and that actually means Lake Superior in Potawatomi, because that's where she came from. That's where her tribe was from. So on my mom's side, I am also Potawatomi and Ho-Chunk, which are two tribes from the Wisconsin area. And like most Native people of my generation, and I am 62 years old now, our parents probably met at some off-reservation boarding school. And so most Native Americans are this tribe and that tribe because their parents met at boarding schools. And so, I'm a product of that. And that gets into, why tribal advocacy. My father worked for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and which, if your audience is not familiar, that is the branch of the federal government that provides most of the services on Indian reservations that the federal government would provide. And to give you a sort of a historical perspective, getting into colonialism, it would be like a European colony somewhere. The governor of that colony would be the one, administering the programs for that colony. That's essentially what the BIA did, and in some parts still does on different reservations in the United States. And so he worked for that his entire professional career, and ultimately, made his way up the organization where they wanted him to run it in DC, and he actually refused to do so, and he turned down promotion after promotion because he saw how you can't really do anything. I mean, you can provide services, but you can't really help the people if the services aren't geared for the people. Put it this way: if you are serving the federal government, you're not necessarily serving the tribal people. And that's sort of what he saw, and that's what he told me. And honestly, that's really what I've done. And because I am this tribe and this tribe and this tribe, I sort of have a more global perspective of what tribes need. And I originally didn't want to do this. I actually wanted to get into media, into filmmaking, and was starting out doing that. And along the way, I found a mentor, and this mentor told me, he said, well, if you ever want to own a new car, and if you ever want to buy a house, find a profession, get a degree and make that be what you do. And then this can be your hobby. And so I actually took his advice to heart. And so 10 years out of college, I went back to law school, and I didn't want to be a lawyer. I never wanted to be a lawyer because God knows the world is filled with enough lawyers. But I wanted to have the law degree because it gives you an opening that not having it wouldn't give you.
Sure. Gives you a platform.
There's sort of, yeah, there's a gravitas to having a JD behind your name, and it opens doors, and it keeps conversations going. And that's what I wanted to do. Is I wanted to have my law degree so that I could help Indian people. I had no idea how to do that, but other than, because the United States government, the whole founding of it is based upon property law. The Bill of Rights, which is, oh yeah, let's protect the people too. That was sort of an add-on. In order to get the Constitution passed, they said, okay, we'll throw in the Bill of Rights too. But it's basically about property law. It's about how to keep the property with the people who own it and how to protect that property. That's pretty much the United States government in a nutshell. And so I wanted to use that legal training for tribal people so that they could use their own property, whether it was real property or intellectual property, for their own benefit. And so that's really what I wanted to do with a law degree, not necessarily, be in a courtroom arguing, esoteric matters of the law, but getting tribal people to start thinking about how they could really exercise their own inner power to do what they wanted to do. And so that's really what I wanted the law degree for.
And let me ask you a naive and perhaps to your mind overly obvious question, but if you're listening to this, say, in Germany or New Zealand, it might not be obvious why Native American people might need that. Why did you feel or still feel that Native American people need that kind of access to the power to argue for their property rights? What's missing that they don't have?
Well, because there are 575 federally recognized tribes in the United States. 236 have reservations, so a land base that they call their home. However, except for a handful of cases, they don't actually own that land. The federal government owns that land, and it's held in trust for the benefit of them. So, for instance, Navajo Nation, biggest reservation in the United States, they don't own a bit of it. They own parcels outside of it, but they're like any other landowner. They own that place. They don't own their reservation. And so the way that the federal laws have been designed is to disenfranchise Indian people from pretty much everything, from their land, from their culture, from their language, from their history. And so that's why it's important for me and professional natives of my generation to get Indian people, especially elected leaders, to start thinking around the lines of, we don't need the federal government's permission to do something. We can just do it. Besides, they're going to give it to us anyway. So why don't we just do it?
Right. The question is, do what? What is the need? Like, if you were to put in a nutshell the lack that spurred you as a younger man to say, look, I need to try and fill this gap here. What is that gap? What is the major disenfranchisement?
The major disenfranchisement is the fact that Indian people have been so colonized that they've forgotten how they govern themselves. What I mean by that is most tribal nations did not have jails. You dealt with a wrongdoing by having the person who did the wrong make things right. So, for instance, if you killed somebody for whatever reason, accident, on purpose, you were jealous, whatever, you then had the responsibility to take care of that person's family for the rest of your life. That was your sentence. And so jump forward to present day, when tribes run their own jail systems, they don't have the capacity to do it the way it's done, say, outside in the local county jail or in the state prisons or whatever. They don't have the personnel, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the programming. For instance, they don't have healthcare in jails, in tribal jails. There is no healthcare in tribal jails. And so rather than trying to perfect jails, why not go back to the old way of doing things, of not jailing people, and make the sentence more in line with how your worldview used to be and how it should be? Because if you don't have the capacity to run a jail, then you shouldn't be jailing people. But if you do have the capacity to monitor somebody's penance through their own atonement work, well, then you could do that. The reason that I mentioned that tribes don't own their land, it's important because they don't own their land, they can't impose property taxes. And without property taxes, you can't run government services. And so everything that tribes do, jails, for instance, all depend upon funding from the federal government. And funding from the federal government it's haphazard. It happens every year. Congress can fund programs for Indian tribes however they want to, and they usually are grossly underfunded. And that's the situation, is if you don't have the capacity to enact property tax to provide services for your people, then you got to rethink how you are going to provide those services and what kind of services you provide. For instance, why run a jail if you don't have the revenue to run it properly? And why not do something that is more in line with your own traditional philosophy of how to deal with wrongdoing? That kind of
is that where you have spent a lot of your career, is in that aspect of trying to change the relationship with wrongdoing? And if so, how on earth do you enforce that?
Well, that is still an unrealized ambition of mine. But you
Okay.
asked why I wanted to get into this.
Okay. So this is like in principle, right?
Yes, in principle.
Got it.
In principle, yeah. And I just use the jail analogy because everyone understands jail. So no matter where your audience is, they all understand, what they're supposed to be and usually what they actually are. So you could imagine in the tribal aspect, they're a lot more degraded than elsewhere. And I've toured tribal jails. They're actually really pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. What have you spent, like, talk us through the highlights of your career in advocacy then. What have been the things that you've worked on? What have you seen succeed?
Well, most of what we've spent, or Brandy and I have spent the last 22 years working on, is infrastructure development that most people take for granted. For instance, you could live in any big city in America or any small, rural county in America, and you're probably going to have electricity, running water, and a paved road outside. Now, you may not be able to afford to hook up to that electricity or that running water, but you can walk on that paved road. It's available to you whether you can afford it or not. In a lot of places in Indian country, there still is not paved roads. There's still not running water. There's still not electricity. There are some places where there's still not telephone service. Nowadays, with cell phone service, that's pretty much over. But even 20 years ago, there were places you didn't have hardwire landline telephone service. just because it was too remote and too cost prohibitive to put it in there.
So I'm just going to play devil's advocate because, of course, when I was a kid growing up in the UK in the late 70s, early 80s, even on the farms 100 miles from London, you didn't necessarily have electricity. People certainly didn't necessarily own a car. The road might not be paved, and this happened somewhat slowly. There'd been World War II, post-war austerity, growth was slow. The general prosperity that one sees now in Western Europe wasn't there. The cities were filthy. They were, falling down. That's changed now. But of course, and when I was a kid I had Portuguese family, and I remember in the countryside in Portugal around then, it was people would still walk, women would walk a kilometer to get water, pots on the head, and rural transport was ox wagons. Not in the capital in Lisbon, but outside in the mountain farms, sure. Again, that changed. Then, of course, I remember seeing Eastern Europe went through its thing and it went from, horse agriculture to mechanized agriculture, kind of in front of my eyes after the wall came down. So, and I remember even when I moved first to Texas 25 years ago or so, the community that we were in certainly didn't have paved roads, and and that was really just outside of Austin. But what you have said is true, because in all of those cases, as soon as the governments could provide those services, they of course did. As soon as those revenues were there, the road outside our place in Texas did become paved, etc., etc. And when I was working as a journalist in, say, on the Navajo reservation back in the 90s, late 90s, and so on, yeah, the life that one saw was remotely rural in that way, that there's, outside of certain places, there just were no services, period. People were self-sufficient, and that was that. And I believe in many cases probably still are. You have worked then trying to get that kind of infrastructure to these places, I presume. How have you
Yes.
done it? And have you been successful at it?
Yeah, we have, because really, when you got to find your champion, whether it's in a member of Congress or it's someone in a federal agency. And once you do, and okay, this might not be how it is right now in Washington, D.C. under this current administration,
Who
but
knows how it is right now in Washington,
in,
D.C.?
in our history, in our experience, and we've been doing this. Brandy and I have been doing this together for 22 years, but we've both been doing stuff like this for the previous 10 years, just not with each other, not our own company. Our experience has been that people come to DC because they want to solve problems. They want to fix things. They want to leave a legacy.
They want to
And
make things better. Yeah.
they want to make things better. And so you find that champion and you take, in our case, our community story, and we usually begin in the local community, and make it tell their story to that person that we eventually find as a champion.
Mm,
It could be their story because they want to be the hero. They want to be the hero of whatever. And so that's how we've been able to do it. We've been able to say, hey, all we need is, a couple $100,000 to do this study, everything with infrastructure. You got to do the preliminary studies, the environmental studies, the historical studies, everything first. And that's usually the first phase. And then afterwards, then you find the funding to actually do the project. But once you've done the first step, which is the studies, the second step is usually much easier because, oh, you've already done step one. Now we just move on to step two. And that's how the process used to work here in DC. Hopefully we'll get back to that someday.
okay.
But yeah.
So there you are, based in DC, originally from deep within the American heartland, but then based in DC. Would a tribe then contact you or your firm, engage your services and say, Jeff, we need this health service. We need this road. We need a better jail. We need a thing.
Right.
Can you help us to find a congressman or woman who will advocate for us and help us find that money to put into place the service? Is that basically describe what you would do?
Exactly. That's exactly
Okay.
how it works.
Can you give us a couple of examples of where that succeeded?
Sure. I don't know how familiar you are with Navajo, but it's in 3 states, you know.
I'm quite familiar with Navajo, and I'll get
Primarily,
into my own story with Navajo in a minute. But
okay,
yeah,
primarily Arizona, New Mexico, and a little part in Utah.
yep.
The Utah section, there is a community there called Navajo Mountain. It's on Navajo Mountain, and it is in the Utah section, but the road to get to it starts in the Arizona section. There is no way to get to it from other places in Utah through Utah. The only road that goes there is in Arizona. So it's a 14-mile road. The students who went there were bused from all over the Utah section, because in the United States, school districts work by districts, but they're confined to their states. And so the Utah school district represented about half of the Utah section of the Navajo Nation. And in order for the kids to get to that school, they had to be bused through the Arizona section and then back up to Utah. It was about a 4-hour one-way drive for some, if not most, of the students.
Wow.
And the parents got frustrated because, obviously when it rains there and the roads turn into mud bogs, the school bus can't get through. And so kids are missing all kinds of school, missing so much school, in fact, that I believe if you miss something like 16 school days in a school year, you actually have to be held back for the next year because you've missed too much school. That was happening repeatedly. Parents were frustrated, and so they actually sued not only the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but the Navajo Nation and the state of Utah to say, hey, fix this road so that, it doesn't take 4 hours to get there, so that kids can get there in a normal, school drive, an hour at most, or school bus drive, an hour at most. The lawsuit was actually successful, and all 3 of the parties, the Navajo Nation, the state of Utah, and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they actually built a brand new school in Utah, 2 new schools, in fact, the primary school and the secondary school, brand new, beautiful facilities, and they paved the road all the way from the school to the Utah border. Problem was, the Arizona side was still a dirt road. So there's 14 miles that was still a dirt road. So the problem was still in existence. So we took that issue and took it to Navajo's representative at the time and said, this is an obvious equal protection argument. This is a constitutional issue. These kids have a constitutional right to get to school like any other kid in any other school district in America. And that was the winning argument. Our member of Congress was able to get us the money for that. And in that time, in that process of getting the roadway paved, what had happened was that the local utility, the Navajo-owned utility, put in new water lines along that right-of-way of the road, and they also put in new electrical and new internet lines. And so not only did we get this 14-mile section of road paved, but they got brand new infrastructure all the way, because the road was actually not being used, and so they could do all of that maintenance work and all that construction work. And so now the Navajo Mountain schools are like state of the art. They're winning awards in Utah. They've got this robotics team that they do robotics competitions all over the country. And so that's sort of like one example. Another example, we got a call from a local Navajo AIDS patient advocacy group saying, we can't get any treatment for HIV AIDS, and our local Indian Health Service is not being responsive, do something about this. So we actually looked into what that was, and we found out that treatment for HIV AIDS, that wasn't anything that the Indian Health Service was authorized to do. They were authorized to provide prevention and awareness and screening, but not treatment. And so that was a pretty easy one. So when the reauthorization for the federal HIV AIDS treatment bill came through, we were able to get the Indian Health Service included in that. And I say that as though that was easy. It actually took us about 4 years to do that. But it was a really easy fix because the local community thought their local Indian Health Service was being unresponsive, not knowing that they weren't able to do this anyway, but we were able to get them to do this. And so now HIV AIDS treatment is available throughout Indian country because we were able to do that.
What's interesting to me about that story is, given that AIDS was such a big thing, surely you as a Native American, would have been aware that that service was lacking, like would have heard someone saying about something about it somewhere. It's interesting. And, I would have assumed, okay, it's a health, there are health services. AIDS is the thing that would be sort of on the, and of course my background's in Africa, lots of it down there. So, it's just front and center. To find out that it wasn't is, let's say, surprising. What were people doing? Were they just dying at home?
Or they'd go off reservation to go seek treatment. Yeah.
Okay. So if they could afford to find some health insurance somewhere, they
Right.
could go and get it, but not on the reservation. If they were dependent upon the local reservation service, they might die.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. Wow. Okay. Tell us another one.
Well, I know Brandy had mentioned this one, but we were able to get the first cancer treatment center on Indian reservation at the Tuba City Hospital on the Navajo Nation, and that was a 10-year process.
Okay.
But the finding the oncologists and finding the pharmacy and all the specialized equipment, that was the easy part. The hard part was getting the federal government to reimburse the services, which they do everywhere else across the country, except for Indian country, because they weren't authorized to do so. And so it was a 10-year process for us to get the federal agency that does that, to get them authorized to do that.
Why were they not authorized, and why would it be difficult to get them to be authorized?
Well, because pretty much everybody in the federal government assumes that, well, since there is a Bureau of Indian Affairs
Right.
and there's an Indian Health Service, they're the ones that do all that stuff, not knowing that they actually don't do all of that stuff. They're very limited in what they can do, even more limited in how they're funded. And so a lot of other federal agencies actually provide services for Indian tribes in Indian country through other programs. It's just that the leadership of those agencies and departments might not necessarily ever even know that or be aware of that. So they didn't know that, and they didn't want to know about that. So that's why it took us 10 years.
Okay. And what are you working on now? What's the current project?
Well, right now the hospital it's the hospital where we were able to get the cancer services stood up. Their actual building is well over 50 years old, and so they want to get it replaced. It's going to be about $1 billion. And as I've told them, there's no pot of money in Washington, D.C. that is $1 billion to replace a hospital. We're going to have to do it in stages and in phases and all that. But no, that's the big one that I'm working on right now, but also because of the work that we were doing with cancer, I'm starting an organization that is going to try to get cancer treatment on reservations more readily. Now that we've been able to get the services reimbursed, now we actually want to start providing services. And so I'm working with a handful of native oncologists across the country. And when I say handful, I mean a handful. There's only 5 that we know of native oncologists, and they're all willing to partner and get this thing going.
Okay. It's very interesting. When I remember when I moved to the USA, one of my first questions was, where do I find Indians? Where do I find Indian culture? And I moved to California when I first moved. And so, it was San Francisco, and my then partner's, friendship circle was very liberal, very progressive, very East Bay. So I
Mhm.
thought, oh, they'll know. In the same way that if you're Southern African, you know where the tribes live. You know that the Xhosas are there in the Eastern Cape. You know that the Sutus are up there in Lesotho. You know that the Swazis are there in Swaziland. There is Zululand. There is up in Botswana. It's the Botswana, the Shona, and the Ndebele. That's Zimbabwe. You know this, and you might be unaware of some smaller tribes, and there also might be not so nice colonial reasons why they are placed where they are placed. But you do know. I mean, you would know where to go, what to see and experience the indigenous culture. What flummoxed me when I got to the USA was like, no. Like, not only did people not know, but they really didn't want to know. And so you would ask people, including liberal, educated, Northern Californians, and the resistance to it and the dismissal of the question was almost a little bit hostile, and it was interesting to me. I thought, wow. And then I would ask, well, aren't you interested? I mean, you're born here. I mean, you're born on that mountain, and surely you'd kind of want to know. And that mountain kind of has an Indian name, or the state has an Indian name, or the river has an Indian name. And aren't you kind of curious about, just who the people were? I mean, are you curious about the history, even if they're not there anymore? No. The answer was like, no. And then I think, what's the difference? Why were people so incurious, almost deliberately incurious? And it's my journalist mind. It's like, well, I've got to know this. And then I realized, oh, I see, because the colonial experience in Southern Africa, while brutal, was not that type of genocide. There were genocides that happened, but overall, there wasn't enough overwhelming white settlement coming in. There weren't tens of millions of people getting on ships from Europe and going down to South Africa. There were, maybe a couple of million. So just pure economics, you're not going to go down and wipe out the labor force. And you couldn't, if you tried. Something might happen, like a smallpox epidemic or a particularly brutal local war. Those things for sure happened. But in general, you were always going to be outnumbered by the people who lived there, which of course meant that sooner or later they were going to take it back. And that's of course what happened. But the story in North America is so different, because the sheer volume of people coming in was greater than the number of people who were living there in the first place.
Right.
And so there was no other way that it was going to go. And I thought, oh, I see, there must be some sort of deep-rooted guilt about that, which makes people incurious who even would, these would be the sort of people who would go to an anti-apartheid rally, or perhaps now it would be something for freedom for Palestine or something. But they
Yes.
wouldn't take up the flag for the local Indian tribe. And so I was asking people, well, who are the local Indians here? There must be. I mean, there were people living here before. I mean, I know San Francisco's, been a Spanish settlement for a long time, but before them, there were people here. And I'm looking on the map. Look, there's reservations. Look. What's that tribe? It begins with M. It's, and have you been there? No. Do you want to go there? No. Why not? Why are you asking these questions? Okay, interesting. So then, of course, I had to go. And I found out about, you asked me about Navajo Nation. I owe a debt of gratitude to Indian country and Navajo Nation. Now, I would say that anyone who's gone and lived in America or benefited from America in any way, of course, owes a debt of gratitude to Native America because they created America. And so if you have benefited from America, you have benefited from the fruits of those peoples. But but in a more direct way. I began a journalistic experience in Navajo Nation that started in the late 90s and then popped up again a couple of times where I was following various land rights issues there in the same way that I was doing it in Africa and reporting on it not for American press but for British press because Brits are interested in it. By the time my son became diagnosed with severe autism, and those of you, who know my story, that I went to Mongolia and there was a very big healing there. And then I was back in Africa. And then I found myself in Australia in the rainforest there. But the final healing was actually on Navajo. And it was this guy called Chi, who also went by the name of Blue Horse. And at the end of that healing, where we sweated on behalf of my son became like properly conversational that day, not a week afterwards, that day. And he did it on I-40 driving out of Navajo reservation. He said something to me that was not what his previous scripted autism, it was, we had just come out of the last ceremony, sunrise ceremony with pollen. And subsequently, various friends of mine went to this healer for various things, and all of them ended up with a very, very positive outcome. And so I have this debt. And also professionally, I have a debt because my first break into journalism was actually given to me by the Cree Indians when I was living up in Canada. I reported on their land rights issue where the government hydro company, Hydro-Quebec, was going to flood, it blew my mind, an area the size of France. An area the size of France to sell this hydroelectricity to the New England states. And the flow of the water was going to be so big that it was going to cause the Earth's crust to shift and release all this mercury from the bedrock. And it actually had happened before in the 70s on a smaller way. So the Cree had managed to get a settlement from the government and they'd used it quite wisely. Quite a lot of their kids had ended up going off to law school because they knew that it would happen again. And of course, when it did, they were sort of ready. And I went and reported on that again, not for the Canadian press, not for the American press, but for the British press. And they were successful. And they gave me that story because I went up there as a completely poverty-stricken freelance journalist, and they flew me around on the seaplanes, and they got me out to the trapping camps on the snowmobiles, and all of this would have cost thousands, so I could get that story out. And so I owe so much to Native America. And I'm always intrigued by how invisible it is when you're in the USA. I was just in Florida, right? I was just in Florida. And I went to visit a friend who lives in a place called Jupiter, Florida, which is just outside West Palm. And I'm driving around, and then I see this little black, brown plaque about a battle. I'm like, that battle, the date, it could only have been against Indians. It couldn't have been against the Spanish or anything. And I remembered, oh yeah, the Seminole Wars. I'd heard of the Seminole Wars. Yeah. So I get on Wikipedia, I look up, and I realize I'm in the middle of Seminole country, and there are actually Seminole reservations around me, but there is zero evidence of it. So why is this, Jeff? What, somewhere like Navajo Nation, okay, in the Southwest, huge areas, vast, you know, remote. Okay, and then when you get in there, oh yeah, okay, here's a big intact culture. But we can understand that it's a schlep to get in there because it's a remote place. But when you're dealing with places like upstate New York or California or Florida. It's not remote.
Yeah.
These people are living right there in the communities. So why is it invisible? Why is Native America invisible? As you know, if you followed any of my work, I'm an autism dad, and we have a whole career before this podcast in helping people with neurodivergence, either who are professionals in the field. Are you a therapist? Are you a caregiver? Are you a parent? Or are you somebody with neurodivergence? When my son Rowan was diagnosed with autism in 2004, I really didn't know what to do. So I reached out for mentorship, and I found it through an amazing adult autistic woman who's very famous, Dr. Temple Grandin. And she told me what to do. And it's been working so amazingly for the last 20 years that not only is my son basically independent, but we've helped countless thousands of others reach the same goal, working in schools, working at home, working in therapy settings. If you would like to learn this cutting edge neuroscience-backed approach, it's called movement method. You can learn it online. You can learn it very, very simply. It's almost laughably simple. The important thing is to begin. Let yourself be mentored as I was by Dr. Grandin and see what results can follow. Go to this website, newtrailslearning.com. Sign up as a gold member. Take the online movement method course. It's in 40 countries. Let us know how it goes for you. We really want to know. We really want to help people like me, people like you out there live their best life, to live free, ride free, see what happens.
2 reasons. I'm going to give you the simple answer first, is because Native Americans are also Americans. And so when you live in an urban area, say in Southern California or Phoenix or Albuquerque or Miami, it's hard to differentiate where the suburbs end and the reservation begins because you have the same businesses. And so Native Americans are Americans. They like the same fast food culture and big box store culture as everyone else. And so that's the easy answer. The harder answer is because of the checkerboard system. Now, this goes way back in US history. Basically, to get the railroads built, the federal government promised the railroads, hey, every 10 miles, we're going to give you, a 10-mile stretch, and it can go for another 20 miles so that you can build your towns. And, obviously, because it was steam engines, they needed every 10 miles or so, they needed to get water from their engines. And so you could build that infrastructure there and put towns in, and you could sell all that, lease all that property to pay for all this. We'll give that to you. Well, where did that land come from? It came from reservations. The reservations that were negotiated, that's where that land came from. And so part of it was building the railroads took a lot of Indian land. And then the Allotment Act, which, when public lands were open to homesteaders, they said, hey, come and get all your 40 acres and you can prosper and you'll succeed. And so that's where a lot of reservations became diminished because of that. And so I know that you've experienced this, because I've heard you speak about this, where you're on a reservation and you don't know you're necessarily on a reservation. And that's also because of right-of-way. If you're driving on a highway, that is not the reservation. That's the right-of-way or of the state or the county. And so all of the billboards, all of the gas stations, basically everything in that right-of-way is going to look as though it's any road, any place else. And it isn't until you get off of those roads and go a couple of miles into to the communities that you'll actually find the Indian settlements, the people, and that. But I also think that what you touched on earlier is also true. There's a lot of white guilt in Americans. They don't want to know, and so they don't want to see it. And so they're more than happy to go buy tax-free cigarettes and tax-free gasolines on reservations, but that's the extent of it.
Right. I've got a challenging question. So colonialization is a two-edged sword. You know, if you ever seen Monty Python's Life of Brian, you
Of
know, and
course.
there's the scene where it's the Liberation Front, you know, the Judean Liberation Front. What have the Romans ever done for us, eh? Hey, you know, it's like, well,
When roads,
aqueducts. Well,
water.
apart from aqueducts, what are they? Well, roads. Well, apart from roads, what are they? And then they go through the, well, apart from roads, aqueducts, healthcare, you know, blah, 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 you know, what have they ever done for us? And it's poignant because you said, you know, Native Americans are Americans. They like box store culture. They like fast food culture, etc., etc. And I'm curious about that because that is, of course, the hand of colonialism, if you like, destroying culture. And you and I both know that there are many, many enclaves of Native America within all over North America where actually the original culture is very, very strong, to the point that, like, I've been on the valley floor of Canyon de Chelly in Navajo country where it's like a traditional life from about 100 years ago. And people living down there to some degree choose that. But that's by no means, you know, everywhere. Why do you, and then I remember when we met at the Equus Film Festival in Montana last year, and I remember there was a movie about the Blackfoot Nation and their relationship with horses and the land and so on. But as an outsider, I have to say, it looked like just other normal American sort of semi-ranch type people living in trailers, dressing like white people, driving the same truck, basically adopting the same culture, the same. And there was a lot of talk about the culture in that movie. And then you saw like little snippets of it. But mostly what you actually observed as an outsider is like, no, look, dude, it looks exactly the same as anywhere else in white Western America. What's the difference?
Mhm.
Naive question. So my question is, in a state of being where one is fighting for advocacy, self-advocacy, why the wholesale adoption of the colonial culture?
Because the traditional culture has been taken away. And so a lot
Mm,
of people don't necessarily know. It's not their experience. They don't know what their traditional culture is.
okay.
And so they're like anyone else, they're searching. They're looking at things, you know, and in order for culture to survive, it has to adapt. And so
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you a story, and hopefully this will illustrate what I mean. So, you know, Brandy, she's Choctaw, one of the 5 civilized tribes, and they're called civilized tribes because they were the
Brandy, by the way, is Jeff's wife, who runs the
yes,
Native American Humane Society. Please go and check her interview out on Equine Assisted World, my other podcast, because it's really a great interview. But just when he says Brandy, that's who he means. Okay, sorry.
yes. Okay. So yes, so she's a member of Choctaw Nation. They're part of the 5 civilized tribes. They're called the civilized tribes because early on they adopted English, they adopted Christianity, they wrote their own constitutions, and like the rest of America, they had African slaves. And so they're called the 5 civilized tribes, right? Speak English, right? Became Christians really early in their history.
Settled in towns
Yes, settled in towns, had
that look
newspapers,
like colonial towns.
yes,
Yeah.
had constitutions, had sheriffs and all that stuff, right? And a couple of years ago, we were driving through Oklahoma and we went to Durant, which is the capital of the Choctaw Nation. They had just opened their cultural center. It actually had opened just as COVID hit. So when they opened, they actually didn't open. And so we were there, you know, a few years afterwards when, you know, it was safe to come out again. And they were actually having their big opening. And so we were there And when we got there, there was a Navajo woman who was the person, the hostess who introduced us because she married a Choctaw guy. And she said, "Oh, here's our programming. Here's what here's what you might want to do today." And one of them was Choctaw language classes. And so, Brandy perked up immediately, and we went into them, and they were singing hymns. And it finally dawned on me. They became Christians so that they could hide their culture right out in the open. They were singing hymns in Choctaw. And it dawned on me right then and there. Okay, now I get it. So the Choctaw Nation has probably per capita some of the highest fluent speakers of anywhere. They are I believe they're the second largest tribe in the country, Navajos being the first. And I know Navajos has a pretty big fluent speaker numbers, but I believe Choctaw is just right behind them. And it's not that they don't like say, "Oh, English is bad." No, it's that they've been able to keep their culture because they adapted this persona of being just like white people. And so they were able to shield it for themselves. And I think that is more prevalent than not. Now you said, you've been to enclaves where there's thriving cultures. I've been to places where there are what are called unacknowledged tribes, federally recognized tribes, meaning, you have a relationship with the federal government, it's based on a treaty or a statute or something, but there's some federal reason why the United States government deals with you as a tribe as a separate political entity. That's called federal recognition. There are what are called unacknowledged tribes in that they never had that interaction. And so they're just these small rural communities off in the mountains or wherever, the desert floor, wherever. And they haven't ever had that experience. So they're completely intact. They've got their language, they've got their culture, they've got their religion. And even though they speak English and they go to schools and all that, they still have all of that because that was never taken from them. And I've been there. I've seen it. It exists. And so I think there's the extreme way of, we're gonna adapt everything that white American culture has, and we're gonna take it on as our own and hide our own truth inside that. Or, hey, you never bothered to deal with us, therefore you never took anything from us. And I think most tribal people, they're definitely somewhere in between either ends of that, which is why, the film on the Blackfeet Reservation, yeah, they look like ranching people because they've always been ranching people. Even before horses, they were doing animal husbandry with the wildlife. This past summer, we were in North Dakota. We went to a powwow, and we were both amazed. There's this brand new powwow dance that it's women, and they're rodeo women, and they dance with the lariats, and the whole thing is to keep the lariat going up while they're dancing.
Sounds like Gangnam Style. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And it's amazing. It's incredible because Indian people do rodeo a lot. I mean, you think, it's a cowboy thing. And, Indian people have been doing that, basically forever.
Well, at least since the colonial experience, I don't know if Indians were doing rodeos before.
Well, not rodeos.
Rodeo itself is a Spanish word, right? I mean,
but animal husbandry work.
Yes, sure. Absolutely. I guess, I'm only asking these questions as devil's advocate because I think it's important for people to try and, who are not familiar, to kind of understand where Native America's at. And it's confusing because you can meet, as you say, you can meet a tribal person and they come across to a large extent just like any other American. And then you're like, well, then where's the lack? Why are you guys so poor? You don't look poor. You're wearing a nice, Then you're driving a nice car. There you are. You're living in Washington D.C. You've got you're a lawyer. You've got a job. Yeah. Where's the problem? And just as people from outside of America don't see white American poverty, which for sure exists. I've lived in rural Texas and the rural South, and or people might, on the other hand, have a perception of, say, Black America, and think, well, Black America's all ghetto, and it's like, well, some of it is, but no, a lot of it isn't actually. There's a lot of people who do very well, and blah blah blah, and all points in between. But I think because the Native American experience is so poignant, obviously the Black American experience is as well, but the Native American experience of dispossession, first of land, then of culture, as you said, and then after the conquests, even after the reservations, then being put into these schools where you weren't allowed to speak your language, and that, and when you were saying, oh, well, people are searching for their culture, someone listening to this might say, well, why? I mean, it seems that the culture's everywhere from what you guys are saying. There's 500 and something tribes, and there's this and there's that. But as you begin to recount the story, you go, oh, I see, unless you were one of those, if you like, uncontacted type tribes, or happen to be, cocooned by the geographical isolation of the middle of the Navajo reservation, which is the size of Ireland, or something like that, then you might well have actually found yourself in a cultural no man's land as a sort of alien within your own place. And I could see that leading to a kind of despair that, of course, you see when you meet Native American homeless people in cities, and all the substance abuse and all the the stuff that you see, and then inherited trauma. We now know much more about epigenetics. When one goes up into places like the Pine Ridge Reservation or the Rosebud Reservation, than the Lakota tribes up there, where you think, well, why would they be so effed up? Because they're the ones who came out with their spirit intact, their military spirit. They beat Custer, they won all these battles, Red Cloud, and Sitting Bull, and all these people, and they're national heroes even outside of a bazillion movies. Why then are these the poorest and most effed up places in America? Well, yeah, they won those battles, so therefore the government was going to go in and make sure they didn't win any more. And yeah, which is interesting, because in Zululand in South Africa, where my grandfather came from, the Zulus beat the British army fair and square. Huge battle of Isantwana. They wiped out 2 British regiments, had to climb over their own dead to do it, but they did it. And because of that, weirdly came out of the colonial experience with a real sense of pride, and therefore weirdly less animosity towards whites. But they didn't have the overwhelming emigration. They were still, of course, massively abused and under apartheid and so on. But it wasn't, I guess they just weren't so outnumbered and overwhelmed. So when you talk about, when one encounters people's attitudes towards Native America, there's often an assumption, particularly within white America, that that the Native Americans actually do have money, and they're just kind of lazy and have no work ethic. And you hear this a lot. Like, you hear, well, they don't have to pay taxes, and they've got all this and they got all that, and they have these casinos, and the casinos make billions. So where's all that money going, eh? And why should we American taxpayers have to pay for these guys who don't pay taxes, who have all this money coming from, say, perhaps oil and gas, or perhaps from casinos, etc.? And I think a lot of those people are asking those questions in good faith because they themselves don't know. Again, because of this invisibility issue. So can you answer that? Why are American reservations, Indian reservations, so poor when huge natural resources, when gambling, etc., etc.? Why? What's the disconnect? What's going on? What's happening?
Well, the short answer is that money doesn't stay on the reservations. Obviously, with the resource extractions, it's the companies that are doing it.
Right.
The tribe's getting a small royalty. I mean, there's been, it's documented. There's court cases, been going on for decades, if not, a century now, of how mismanaged the federal government is with tribal resources, and that they don't even get market rates for them. They get, less than that. And so that's sort of like the easy one. The other one is with gaming, most people assume that it's the tribe that is, running this and therefore getting all the profits. Well, most of these casinos, they're financed by outsiders. Some of them, it's one of the tribes in Connecticut. I don't remember if it's the Pequots or the Mashantuckets, but I believe the Sultan of Brunei is the one who put up money for that. And of course, it's a long-term, like 30-year loan. And so the profits go to pay back the debt, and part of the federal law that regulates gaming on Indian reservations, it was actually crafted by the State Governors Association so that they would get the lion's share of any profit. So that is why, if you're aware of this, there are a handful of really, really profitable tribal gaming enterprises across the country, and they give money to, the local volunteer fire department to build, new stations, get new fire trucks. They put up the new little league ball fields, new auditoriums for the local high school, all that stuff. That's because that's part of the federal law that regulates Indian gaming, is a portion of any profits goes to the local adjacent community. And then eventually some of it does come down to the tribe providing for itself. And there are some tribes where they are making obscene amounts of money, and their individual members are getting tens of thousands of dollars a month. And there is that, oh, well, they don't work, they're lazy. Well, they don't have to work. I mean, if I was getting $30,000 a month, I wouldn't work.
Yeah,
but I'm not.
But why are some gaming enterprises then able to pay tribal members $30,000 a month and others not?
Because they are a bus rides from New York, or they're in suburban Southern California. They're where people are who want to gamble, and most Indian tribes are not. And so, they're most Indian tribal casinos are on some, not even a interstate highway. They're on some US highway out in the middle of, ranch land where, if you're lucky, there's 50 people there that night,
Yeah.
They're not where people are. That's why some of them aren't very successful.
If there are a handful, though, that are really successful.
Yes, there are.
Are you able, in your advocacy work, let's say you want to pave that road in Utah, or you want to build that new hospital for the cancer center, can you go to those other tribes? Is there that kind of solidarity in Native America, or is there not? Would a tribe, would the Pequots say that's not our concern, or would they say no, that's definitely our concern?
It's a case-by-case basis. Most of them have philanthropic foundations, but they are, like any philanthropic foundation, they're basically concentrating on, their geographic area. So you couldn't go to somebody in Connecticut for a project in, say, Arizona. You could go to the Arizona tribes and say, hey, can you do this thing in Arizona? And, if it aligns with what their principles are, then sure, you could ask them. But it's like anything else. You need to have that relationship already established with them. That takes time to cultivate. So to answer your question, no, there isn't that general overall solidarity, but you can find connection points if their philanthropic guidelines align with with what you're asking for.
So the question again, as an outsider, is why isn't there that solidarity? So if all Native Americans have had this same basic experience of genocide, colonialization, just having a really, really awful time at the hands of European colonials, that's a common experience that presumably binds people together. And as you say, being thrown into schools where there's different tribes and so on and so on. So people are marrying across the tribes and so on. So what prevents that solidarity?
Well, I think it's a legacy of the whole divide and conquer practice. The federal government, it deals with tribes across the country based upon which federally administered region that they are in, and so you'll have those tribes all get together and meet and discuss about their things, the others their own, and so there's never really a time or a place for tribes ever just to get together on their own. There are a few national tribal organizations, but they're actually funded primarily by the federal government, by the federal governmental agencies that these organizations are supposed to provide oversight to. But when you're being funded by them, you don't really police them. And so that's really what happens. So I think there really isn't that avenue to do that. And hopefully that's kind of what I'm been trying to do is get elected tribal people or just tribal people in general to start thinking, hey, just because the federal government told us we have to do it this way doesn't mean we have to do it this way.
Right. I mean, there must have been people who had this vision. I mean, you would think, where is the Native American Martin Luther King? That there has there never been anyone who said, "I have a dream," and also effectively, listen, lads, these guys are always going to do us up the backside unless we get together. And I can see how the legacy is not just divide and conquer. It was also divided before white people showed up, right? People have been at war with each other. Nations have been at war with each other in Native America long before anyone from Europe ever showed up. And I could see, of course, that doesn't go away. The old rivalries exist in Europe. Why wouldn't they exist everywhere else in the world? But nonetheless, when you're all getting it from the man in the same way, you would think at a certain point people would go, all right, in the 500-year, 600-year history, someone would go, all right, look, it's pretty clear that unless we present some sort of united front here, nothing's going to change. Do you think that can happen, will ever happen? And if so,
I'm optimistic that it can happen. I'm dubious that it will happen because people are people. People, have their own animosities. And yeah, there's definitely tribal animosities which will prevent that from happening across certain divides. And that goes way back. That's all pre-contact animosities and warfare. And those probably will never be resolved. But people are people, and people, have their own agendas. And you're right. There is no Native American Martin Luther King. There hasn't been for hundreds of years, and the last ones were, military leaders who tried to create these tribal alliances, and some cases did, and some cases were not successful. But there hasn't been any in contemporary times, and it's a shame. But I also think that because the native population is so small, that that most tribes are just a collection of a handful of families, and this family is in power once they're in the elected positions, and then that family gets power once they get an election. And so there's those familial intertribal squabbles that will prevent that from happening. But I do think that because the population is so small, that the vision for unity, that conversation almost never happens, because someone will say, oh, well, we can't do this because of X, Y, or Z. And the other person will say, oh, well, and I wouldn't want to do it with you because of this, there, or that. So I think if the population was larger, that would be an easier conversation, because those voices would just sort of be background noise. But right now they're prominent.
Yeah, it's interesting to me. You would have thought that the same issue would have pervaded in Black America, because again, to the outsiders, Black America is a thing, but of course, Black America's many, many, many cultures, not all of whom were on good terms with each other, and yet they did manage to forge a movement that fundamentally shifted the political landscape. I'm optimistic. I think people can change. Like, it's really interesting if you look at, say, Scandinavia, right? We all look at Scandinavia as like, Canada is the Scandinavia of North America. North America is the Canada. It's they're the Canada of Europe, and enlightened liberal people who have great policies of social this and social that, and look after their environment. And it was not always so. There were these people called Vikings who committed all sorts of atrocities, and you could even argue that the Northern European colonial experience was just a continuation of the Viking tradition. Yet somewhere along the line, they stopped doing that and became transformed into a very different society. Mongolia, when I was in Mongolia, this was really interesting. The most brutal and violent culture on the planet, exploding out of Mongolia. Like, we kill everybody, kill everybody from the Pacific to the Mediterranean, once every 50 years. And then, whoa, that's a bit tiring, wasn't it, lads? And so then they end up, going back to the heartland and sort of recovering for a generation or so. And then they kill everybody again. And, you got Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan and Tamerlane and all these people, And then somewhere in the 17th century, you get these Tibetan monks wandering over the Altai Plateau and talking about this thing called Buddhism. And like, in one generation, the Mongolians go, yeah, that's a good idea, actually. Yeah, maybe we should do that. Or the Berlin Wall coming down, or the end of apartheid, or whatever. So I just wonder, do you think that maturation process is round the corner somehow for Native America? Because it seems that as long as I've been involved in North America, the problems, despite growing prosperity generally, have remained really acute in Native America. The social problems, the poverty, as you said, all the things that you outlined. Despite, as you say, some people, of course, do very well, but we know that that's not the norm. Sooner or later, there kind of has to be a collective pinching of the skin and kind of going, all right, listen, we gotta do it differently, because we're still here, right? I mean, that is an achievement. As you say, it's a very small population, but that is actually a testament to an achievement, because by rights, y'all shouldn't exist. I mean, if you think about the effort that went into annihilation of native community, one just has to start reading the histories, and it's criminal.
Mm-hmm.
But it was final solution type criminal. It was very well thought out, mass death on an industrial scale. And just as Hitler couldn't kill all the Jews, though he gave it good old college try, they couldn't obviously complete the genocides to the Native Americans, but they jolly well had a go. And I lived in Texas. That's Comanche country, right? I lived in the middle of Comanche. Not one Comanche, within 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 miles. They got rid of them, like, really efficiently, But yeah, there's still some sitting up there in Oklahoma where they shoved them. They're still there. You guys are still there. And there you've got people like you sitting in Washington, D.C., advocates. You must have this dream somewhere in you.
Oh, of course they do. Yeah, it's something that I've wanted and thought about and contemplated. And that's why when I started, I said, Native professionals of my generation, because it is something that people do talk about. It's like, when are we going to get over these petty squabbles and actually get into the game and do something about this? And so yeah, it is something that that I dream about, but I'm not sure how it's actually going to happen, because as long as the federal government basically controls pretty much every aspect of tribal governments, and it does, that's not a conversation that's going to happen at the tribal governmental level. It may happen elsewhere, and that's where my optimism comes from. Is it may happen at the community level, it may happen at the grandma level.
Yeah.
It's got to happen somewhere, because I think the it's too easy to distract the tribal government by doing something else. It's like throwing a ball at a dog. The dog's going to go chase it. Rather than stay where they are, stay at the attention and do what needs to be done. So I think that conversation, as far as I know, it hasn't happened yet, but it could happen, just not in the arena of tribal government.
I agree with you. I think that I mean, let's face it, Martin Luther King didn't happen at the federal government level, and we also know what happened to him. But let's dream a little bit. Okay, let's say it happens at the community level. Let's say it happens at the grandma level. What happens? Fantasy scenario. What happens and how does it play out? And what does America then look like 50 years after that happens? As you may know, if you've been following my work, we are also horsey folk here. And we have been training horses for many, many years in the manner of the old classical dressage masters. This is something which is often very confusing for people. We shine a light on that murky, difficult stuff and make it crystal clear. If you'd like to learn to train your horse in the manner of the old masters and really have fun and joy for you and your equine, go to our website, heliosharmony.com, sign up as a premium member and begin to take the Helios Harmony course, which will take you from zero to the piaffe, where the horse is dancing on the spot, in hand, on the ground. And then from there, you can develop out to anywhere you want to. heliosharmony.com to unlock the secrets of the old masters.
Well, I think it first starts off with everybody airing their grievances, whatever they are. Get them out in the open and done with, because there is so much trauma that you can physically see people carrying this trauma with them. They're hunched over. It's in them. You can see the pain in them. And I think once you start to let it out, I think it'll happen. And I think once people aren't overburdened with whatever the trauma is, whether it's immediate trauma from something they've experienced or it's this historic trauma, it's still there, it exists, it's real, and there isn't a way to, I think, deal with it in a healthy manner. There are no Indian Health Service programs to deal with people's historic trauma, put it that way. You can go to a local clinic and get that service. It doesn't exist.
Right.
But once people have done that and they sort of relieve themselves, or at least, released some of that anguish and pain, you can start talking about, oh, okay, we can start dreaming. We can start thinking about possibility. We can start doing things differently. Perhaps we should stop disenrolling our members. I mean, that would be a great idea.
Tell me about that. I wouldn't even know what that means.
Because tribes have been successful with gaming, some tribes have just started disenrolling their members because they they don't want to share the profits. They want to keep them all to themselves. And so it's a thing that's been going on for the past 20 years now. Tribes will just disenroll people.
How does one get away with that? I mean, if you're born into that tribe, that's like that's like denying your stripping you of your citizenship. How can that happen? How does that happen?
Well, the current tribal government will say, we no longer recognize these families as being, legitimately members of our tribe. And they'll point to some historic, thing about that family line to say that's why they're not a member of the tribe. And because it's the tribal government, they can do it. And the federal government says, oh, it's an internal tribal matter. We can't do anything about this. And so you've got this phenomenon now where tribes are disenrolling their members. In the short term, what that does is that increases their own percentage of whatever, gaming profits there are, but it also decreases their tribal members. And federal services are based upon how many members of the tribe you have. And eventually, one of the consequences of a federal law that's about 100 years old now, it's called blood quantum. Only members of your tribe that have this amount of Indian blood in them are considered members of your tribe. Once they fall below that amount, they're no longer members of your tribe. They're no longer Indians. And so, the genocide, it still is going on. It's just a paper legislative genocide now. Whether the federal government does it through blood quantum or whether tribes themselves do it through disenrollment, it's happening. So basically, the ultimate result of genocide is when you get people to kill themselves, which is what is happening now. And so if tribes can stop disenrolling people, that will be a big step into realizing a better future.
Do you think? Are you any part of trying to get that to happen? I mean, and is there an appeal process? And could you go and say and get a DNA test and say, actually, look, I am, totally a member of this tribe because look, here's the DNA test. What recourse would do people have if that? And is it arbitrary and sudden? Does someone just like get a letter through the mailbox saying, sorry, you're not a member of the tribe anymore? And so how does it happen? Is there an appeal process? What about DNA tests? And how would people stop? How would you stop this process in terms of genocide? Interesting.
And well, there is no appeal process. As I mentioned before, if a currently, legitimate tribal government decides they want to disenroll, so many people, they can do it.
Right.
And the federal government, who's supposed to have oversight, always says, this is an internal matter. We're not going to deal with it. It's an internal tribal matter. We have no say over this. And of course, they like that because the less tribal people they have to deal with, the easier their job is.
Yeah.
So there is no appeal process. As far as I know, there's no, movement to try to rectify this. There is no, DNA fight to
because there ought to be, right? If there's a blood quantum, there ought to be a DNA answer to that, right?
Yes, there should be. Well, and the thing too is as I've been saying all along is, this federal law that says there's blood quantum, tribes don't have to follow that. They can say, no, this is what we consider to be a tribal member. And it could be somebody who's been a historic member of a tribe. I mean, historically, you didn't even have to be Indian to become a member of a tribe. A tribe could just adopt you in, and then now you're a member of the tribe. I mean, it could get back to that at some point. And I think for a lot of tribes where they're dwindling down to, just a couple of dozen members, they need to do something like that. Otherwise, they're not going to be a tribe anymore. They're not going to exist.
Right. That would seem to be logical. So it's intriguing to me because let's say somebody is going to get stripped of their citizenship for whatever reason, which is like one of the most extreme things that can happen, and it almost never happens. There would be all kinds of legal challenges that could and would be made, if someone was to try and take away your American citizenship or your British citizenship or whatever. It's so extreme. If it happens, you've got to be a member of a terrorist organization or something.
Yep.
So I'm a little bit stunned to know that there's no appeal process and that there'd be no DNA answer to it. But equally, as you say, why not adopt people in? And then why not be very wise about who you adopt? Like, why not adopt Warren Buffett? Why not adopt Jeff Bezos? And say, all right, now you're a homie, so let's see some of that money to build a hospital or two, please. Which clearly they've got that money. Is it something like that actually? Is it something about no longer trying to protect culture and hold it apart? And coming back to my question about why would Native Americans adopt so eagerly white culture, but actually could there be a wisdom in that integration in order to sort of do a more successful version of what the Choctaws did? To say, okay, well then let's swell our numbers and then let's decide, okay, if your family has been in America at all for some generation, or even if you just got off the boat and we like you, maybe all new American citizens. Like when I got my American citizenship, what if 32 tribes had come to me and said, sort of made a little presentation to me, said, which one of us would you like to, we'd love to have you. Of course, if we have you, we'd like you to, rather like a church, we'd like you to pay a tithe, and that would go towards some of the things that we did. But here are the benefits of being a member of this tribe or that tribe. It's very interesting, isn't it, that isn't the way of thinking. Do you think something like that could happen?
I think it's possible. I don't think it's realistic. I don't think tribes would want to do it, but I definitely see the benefit of how you could increase your political reach if you had people who had different skill sets and different economic levels. I definitely see that, and that's, again, I go back to, that's something that tribes used to do, used to adopt people, in my part of the country, in North Dakota, the first Europeans we met were the French, and, we adopted French people into our tribe, and the Hidatsa's knew French before they knew English, so it's not out of the realm of possibility. I do like your idea of Warren Buffett. That's
yeah. I mean, why not? It's like,
but
is every American president an honorary member of a tribe, for example? They should be, shouldn't they?
They should be. Exactly. I think tribal people would probably be more comfortable with somebody like Mark Ruffalo, because he's out there on the front lines whenever there's an issue.
Yeah, sure. But
so having the Hulk would be a big catch. But I don't know, but seriously, I think that there are a lot of people who don't know that they do have Native heritage. It might be family lore, it might be suspected, and of course now with DNA, you can be more certain of that. But I mean, I think to start the conversation, it would have to be something along, that kind of scientifically, sort of genetically. There's got to be a more than just, oh, you want to be a member of a tribe. There's got to be something there. No, I definitely like the idea of what can you bring, not tribes going to a new citizen and saying, hey, here's what we can offer you, but people coming to tribes saying, here's what you can offer the tribe. Here's my skill set. Here's my reach. Here's here's everybody that I know who will go to their member of Congress and do this thing for you. You know,
Mm.
I
Yeah,
think
I wonder if the tribes can have like a golden visa type thing. It's like, yeah, you can come in and you can live here and you can have a nice house and you can do all this but it's going to cost you 500 grand and you need to build that hospital. But it seems to me though that because what we're dealing with is the idea of nations. Some people say tribe, some people say nation, right?
yes,
And nations can nation build, or they can decline and die or become absorbed into other nations. And we know that's the process of history. It just is intriguing that despite all attempts to extinguish it, Native America is still there. And as you say, so many people who have lived for more than a couple of generations in North America do have native blood. And perhaps that is something that might bring things to a better pass. And you yourself now you've lived a long time in DC doing this advocacy work, legal advocacy work, and you and your wife are now moving back to the Dakotas. I mean, that's why you're sitting in that empty room. I happen to know because you're moving house. You've
yes.
gone and you bought this old school on is it the Mandan and Arikari reservations
No,
you were telling me?
we're in eastern North Dakota. We're about 4 hours from my reservation,
Okay.
1 hour west of Fargo.
So you yourself are deciding to go back to Native America.
Yes.
Why and what are you going to do there?
Well, as you mentioned, we bought this old school and we're going to turn it into our house, but also it's going to be, you know, where our businesses are located. So Tomhave Group will be there, and Brandy, executive director of Native American Humane Society, that will be centered there. This new cancer treatment network that I'm creating, that will be centered there. So not only what's going to be our residence and the center of our businesses, but because it is an old school, we intend on keeping one of the classrooms as an old classroom. I mean, as a classroom, so that we can invite different tribal governments, different tribal entities and organizations there, so that we can conduct trainings. They can have their own trainings and meetings there. Since we will be, in North Dakota, we are just a couple of days drive from about half the reservations in the country. And so that is really important to us. Plus, when we made this purchase and I told my cousin who runs the hospital on my reservation, said, "Hey, I'm going to be 4 hours away from you." She said, "Great." She said, because, other than her immediate family, all of her extended family have left. And she said, "So great. So you can come back for, all of the birthdays and holidays, but especially the tribal ceremonies," which, because I've never lived there, I've never been able to participate in them. I've always lived, a few time zones away. So it's never anything that was ever in, my thinking. But now that she's thinking, yeah, you can come for the tribal ceremonies, to these, sacred ceremonies, which I've never been a part of. That's really something that I'm looking forward to,
Mm.
especially since, I'm getting older, and,
Yeah.
none of us are going to last forever. So I actually want to be able to pass this stuff on to our son so that he knows it, well before he's in his 60s.
Yeah. 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 No, I mean, like I said, further back in this conversation, I myself just personally owe several debts of gratitude. I taught, to Native American ceremony. I told you about the one with my son. Previous to that, also on Navajo Nation, I attended a sweat that was for the Bushmen because I brought the son Bushmen to the Navajo Nation as part of our attempts to help them get their legal title to their ancestral land back in Botswana, and it was indeed successful. The medicine man at that healing said to me, "Do you hunt?" And I said, "I do, but it might not be a type of hunting you're familiar with, 'cause fox hunting, British fox hunting." And he said, "That's not important. I'm just getting it loud and clear from the spirit world that you have to give it up, and it's somehow connected to your son's autism. I didn't even question it. I gave it up right there and then. And then a lot of really positive things in my life happened like from that point. When we got into Washington, D.C., and we went into the State Department, finally, we testified before Congress, Congressional Human Rights Caucus, and all this stuff. But it was when we walked into the State Department, we walked into the office of a man who was going to give us an interview, and he happened to be Apache. And he just looked at the guys that I was coming with. He said, I know exactly what you're dealing with. I grew up on the reservation there. And he just picked up the phone and he called the Botswana land minister in front of us and said, you guys are supposed to be our trade partners. I've got, 5 guys sitting here from the counter who said they've been tortured and and illegally evicted. What's going on? And this had a massive seismic effect. The woman who set up that meeting was called Rebecca Adamson, who's Lumbee Indian from and ran First Nations Development Institute, which was basically the force in America that supported our work in Africa, again, Native America. And then quite recently, as recently as 2021, I was going through a real personal crisis. And I ended up with a Lakota medicine man who put me through a ceremony that absolutely dealt with the issue. And I walked into that ceremony with the issue, and I walked out of that ceremony without the issue. So, and I wonder how many people have a story like that. I think more people, I happen to have a few of them, but I feel that Native America has been subsidizing, if you like, white America for a very long time, partly by simply virtue of geography. It's your place, with, to some degree, guests. But equally by still creating this sacred heartland. And you know that feeling. You've spent time on Navajo. You know that particularly when you're down in the Southwest and you're on Navajo Nation, Hopi Nation, and those places, and some of the surrounding ones, you absolutely feel that you're touching the living heart of the continent. And I know even very sort of conservative, skeptical people, white people, would say the same thing. There's something about Monument Valley. There's something about those landscapes. There's something about Bryce Canyon or whatever. You are now going back in there. You have this dream, this quiet Luther King type dream. Although I wish you a much better outcome personally. What do you see coming out of this place, this education and cultural and service center that you're going to start, as you say, at the heart of, within 2 days' drive of every Indian reservation, pretty much, in the country? Dream irrationally, please. Don't let rationality hamper you. Let's say 30 years after you die. What would you like to, 50 years after you die, what would you like to see coming out of that place? What changed landscape would you like to see? What's the legacy?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, because this is something that Brady and I have been talking about. And one of the things that I want to do as Tomhave Group, because as we mentioned before, we do our advocacy in Washington, D.C., and we've been basically guns for hire. People have an issue, they hire us, and we take care of it for them. I actually, using the gunslinger analogy, I don't want to be the gunslinger. I want to teach them how to shoot on their own. I want to teach them how to advocate. And ever since COVID, being in DC doesn't matter, because all meetings are virtual nowadays anyway.
Yeah.
You almost never go in and have an in-person meeting anywhere in DC. And even if you do, it's a hybrid meeting. Some people are there. The major principals probably are elsewhere. So being in DC doesn't matter anymore. And so I think us moving to North Dakota, we're gonna jump on that opportunity. You don't have to be in DC to do this work anymore. And
Right.
and if we can teach younger people how to do this, younger people than me, obviously, who aren't jaded, who
Is that
still
what the JD after your name stands for?
still believe that things can work. Well, you have to have that optimism, you have to have that energy in order to realize those things. So what I'm hoping to do is train, a couple of dozen people so they go back to their own home communities, and so that 50 years from now, they're the ones who are doing this for themselves. They're not hiring any of the big fancy, white shoe law firms here in Washington, D.C. to do the work for them. And believe me, most tribes do, including the Navajo Nation. They hire the big DC law firms to do this stuff. And I've been in meetings with those people. They don't know anything that you've testified in front of Congress. They don't know anything that you don't know how to do. It's like this is not rocket science. It's not, there's not an alchemy here. It's telling a good, compelling story to a receptive audience. And if they're not receptive now, make them receptive in the future. That's a skill set that anyone has. But there's some particulars, how to do the dance steps, so I want to teach them the dance steps. But basically, once they know the dance steps, they can do this however they want to. And it will be more effective if the advocacy comes from the actual communities themselves, because they're the ones who are going to be impacted by whatever the outcome is. And they're the ones who have the more compelling story. And so, like I said, 50 years from now, I want them to have trained people so that they're all doing it for themselves. And maybe that alliance of tribes that I'm hoping for, maybe that'll happen after I'm gone.
I think it's a very, very logical first step. Are there other Tomhave groups out there doing similar stuff? Are you part of a growing network of people like you who are going to start this up across Native America and bring that, because it sounds like you guys would be a very important organ within a body of that, but you might need other organs as well. Are there other people out there doing?
I wish I could say there are tons of us, but in the almost 25 years that we've been doing this, we've never run across anybody who does exactly what we do. And to answer one of your first questions of, why not just be a regular lawyer and make all kinds of money? And I think you couldn't find two JDs, me and Brandy, who make less money. Because if you're going to work in Indian country, you want to do gaming or you want to do resource extraction, that's where the money is.
Yeah.
And that is nothing that we want any part of. First of all, there are plenty of entities out there who are doing that already. We wouldn't compete on that level, nor would we want to. We take the hard approach of working on problems that aren't very lucrative. We've actually had contracts where small communities have paid us just a few $1,000s, and we've worked for them for years. And I mean, over those course of those years, they paid us a few $1,000s just because no one else would do it. It's a relatively easy fix that they're asking for. It just takes time. Other people wouldn't do that. A big, huge Washington, D.C. law firm would not take a client on like that because they don't have the money to pay for all the time that it would take to do the thing you need to do. But we've done it because no one else will. And so I'm hoping that as we train other people, they can do it for themselves and they don't need to hire anybody. But as far as I know, there is nobody that does what we do. We know other consultants who are just, single sole proprietorships, but they're working on specific things. They don't do the advocacy like we do. So there might be a connection to work in different avenues, but nobody that we know of does what we do.
So 50 years from now, we've got, if there's 500 and how many nations?
75.
575. Then if you had 57.5 Tomhave groups dotted about the place,
Mhm.
you'd have a sporting chance of changing the social and political landscape to a lasting degree. I think you are actually enacting that dream. And it's interesting that the only other group I came across, which was First Nations Development Institute, who helped us so massively in Africa, run by Rebecca Adamson, Lumbee Indian, living on the East Coast, was about one of the only other people I ever met who
Mhm.
was doing something similar. And of course, I just had to be, on your website while you were talking about all that, and you kept saying JD after the name, so I had to look up what that means because I'm British, and it's, as it's Juris Doctor, a graduate level professional degree for practicing law, similar to an MD for doctors, signifying completion of law school, blah 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 blah. But what is the difference between JD and a simple lawyer or attorney, and why does it make a difference?
Well, a Gen D is just what you get from law school, from graduating law school. And, being a licensed attorney, you pass the state bar, whatever jurisdiction's bar you're practicing in,
Yeah.
so that you can represent clients, in that jurisdiction, following that jurisdiction's, procedures. So that's what it is. And so, I never passed the bar because I told you I never wanted to practice. I just wanted to have the
Yeah.
JD.
So if you had, again, those 57 JDs, some of whom have 57.5 actually, some of whom have passed the bar, some of whom haven't, but all are working within jurisprudence to this degree. Yes, I think that you are actually fulfilling the progress towards that dream. And that's intriguing to me because in a politically very uncertain time, whether you're sitting in Europe or whether you're sitting where you're sitting or whether you're sitting in other parts of the world, there's a feeling of instability at the moment that I think we haven't felt for 80 years, maybe, in the West. And there couldn't be a more optimal time for a dream like yours that goes back to the heart, I think, of what it means to be American. I also wonder if something like Tomhave Group and the subgroups that come out of Tomhave Group, once you plant yourself back there in North Dakota, I could see this having an international reach as well, where people might want to engage you and the groups that you inspire, similar to the way that the Kalahari Bushmen engaged First Nations Development Institute, and also people practicing international law wanting to come and intern, and get a sense of that. We benefited definitely from pro bono lawyers, many of whom were young lawyers in DC who wanted to come and do pro bono work for us in Africa and get a real knowledge of how that whole thing worked. I could see that happening the other way as well, and people from other parts of the world wanting to come and work on these issues with you all to get an understanding to then bring home to their communities. Even honestly, within Europe, we have these issues. I'm very intrigued to see how you and Brandy proceed. When are you guys officially landing there at that old school and hanging up the shield, hanging up the sign?
Well, as you can see, we're still in the process of moving out of here. So there's some stuff that we have to do to get this place,
Yeah.
on the market. But because it's winter here especially in North Dakota, right now is here in Baltimore. I think it's in the 30s, but this morning when we went for a run, it was 25 degrees, and I think that's what, like 3 or 4 minus Celsius.
Yeah, it's -3 or
So
4.
it's still pretty cold. So we got to wait till winter to be over in North Dakota before we can go in, because
That's August, right?
well, April. So probably mid-April is when we're finally
Yeah.
gonna be leaving here. So hopefully we'll have this place up on the market, May 1st, and we'll be there. And then we'll be, rehabbing the school. And first we have to build our own living space, because it is just a school. But once we do, we'll hope you come by and have a
I
visit.
would love to. I would love to. And North Dakota is a state I've never been to. So I've never been to either of the Dakotas, and I've been intrigued by them forever. So I can see it on the horizon. And I want to have you guys, both you and Brandy, back on the show. Let's give it, a year, 18 months, and see
Sure.
where you guys are at. I'll also be coming back to Montana in September for the same event. So, I don't know if you. And one thing I would love to do is get involved with what you're doing on the mental health, neuropsychiatric side.
Mhm.
And I know that there are also people out there within Native America doing that work very well, like Jessica Whiteplume and so on,
Mhm.
and people like that I could learn a lot from. So, yeah, I think it's an ongoing conversation, and I would love to work together. There's
Yes.
autism and there's all that stuff out there in Native America.
Yes, and I believe Jessica is about 4 hours away from where we'll be. So yes.
Perfect. Okay. So it's watch this space, and Jeff Tomhave has a dream, lads. So let's dream it with him. Yeah, for a better world. Jeff, it's been amazing. Thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
Just give us or I guess I can give it to you because I'm on your website as I speak, where I was, and then I went to. So Tomhave Group, TOMHAVE Group
Come.
.com, right? And the work is really broad. I was cruising around on your site, looking at you've talked about some of the work that you've done, but there's also roads, jails, missing and murdered Indigenous persons, how you do what you do, your Cancer Watch stuff, there's so much on here. I do really recommend listeners, viewers, go on tomhavegroup.com and have a look at the work that they do. And if you are a young, aspiring lawyer or other person who might like to get involved in some way, and perhaps intern or something, I would suggest that you reach out to Jeff and Brandy through that website. Can they do that? Can people do that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Just email info@tomhavegroup.com and we'll get it.
info@tomhavegroup.com.
Yep.
All right. Brilliant. I look forward to the next meeting.
All right. Me too.
Okay. Happy moving.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation as much as I did. If you did, please help us to make more. Please like, subscribe, tell a friend, give us a thumbs up. If you'd like to support us on Patreon, please go to my website, rupertisaacson.com. And if you'd like to find out about our certification courses with autism, education, horsemanship, everyday shamanism, there's a whole range of cool stuff. Putting a show together like this is not an easy task. If you'd like to support us, please consider going to our Patreon page and showing us some love there. Even the smallest donation, it really helps us to keep the good content coming. So go to rupertisaacson.com and click on the Patreon link. Not to mention our excellent merch. Please go to our shop and check out some of our really cool rock and roll themed merch, t-shirts, hoodies, all that sort of thing. rupertisaacson.com, it's all there. I can't wait for our next guest and also to meet you there. In the meantime, remember, live free, ride free.